So yeah, now let's start. Okay, and welcome back. So before we begin with today's sessions, let's quickly recap what we learned in our past session. Okay,
Yeah.
so in past session we covered the messaging fundamental. Okay, Azure Service Bus, Azure Event Grid, Azure Event Hubs, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Functions, and event-driven architecture and enterprise in- integrations pattern. And the most importantly, we learned the applications must communicate reliably. However, the another critical architecture questions remains. Okay, like what happens when the system fails? So in considerations, we consider the virtual machines. Okay, virtual machines crash, disk failures, database corruptions, storage failures, regional outage, natural disaster. So can the business outcome operating? So this brings us to one of the most important responsibility of every Azure or cloud solution architect.
Yeah.
So our today topic is designing the business continuity, backup, disaster recovery, and high availability solutions. Okay,
Okay.
so why today topics matter? First come
Okay.
first. So imagine you are designing Azure infrastructures for a bank, a hospital, an airline, an insurance
Hmm.
company, and an e-commerce platform. Okay, so can these business afford downtime? Absolutely not. Okay, so a few minutes of downtime may result in the revenue loss, customer dissatisfactions, regulatory penalties, data loss, and business interruptions. Okay, so iTech must design the system that continue operating even when the failures occurs. Okay, so now what are the learning objectives for today? So by end of this sessions, you will able to understand the high ability. Okay, understand the high ability, which is HA, understand the disaster recovery, which is DRA, understand the business uh, continuity planning, BCP, and also we look for design resilient Azure architecture. Then also we understand the recovery point objective RPO, and also we look for how to understand the recovery time objective, that is RTO, and we will see some AZ-305 business continuity questions. Okay, and then we think like a enterprise solution architect. Okay, so let's start part one of the, like or we say the subtopic, like which is high availability disaster recovery and business continuity, RPO and RTO fundamental. So let me write here.
Okay.
So okay, so today's first topic is high availability disaster recovery.
Mm.
Okay, business continuity. Okay, RPO and
Mm.
RTO fundamental.
Mm.
Okay,
Mm.
so okay, so imagine a global banking applications. Okay, so its architectures look like a web tier, application tier, database tier, storage, identity services. Okay, so one day data center lost the power. Okay, so question arise: does the application stop? Can customer still access online banking? Is customer data safe? Or how long will recover take? Okay, so these questions define the business continuity architectures. So what is business continuity? So what is business continuity So business continuity means keeping the business operations running during the during and after the disruptions. Okay, the goal is not simply recovering the IT system. The goal is to continue the business. Okay, so business continuity goal is business continues. Okay, this is a goal. Okay, for example, banking, okay, healthcare, manufacturing, and government. Okay, and what is the high availability? So high availability is for surviving the component failure. So high availability or HA ensures your applications remain accessible despite a localized failure like hardware, networking, or virtual caches. Okay, virtual machine caches. It is automated and typically occurs within a single Azure region, sets and zone, like load balancer and auto scaling, and no manual failover required. So if I simplify the high availability, so high availability means minimize the downtime by eliminating the single point of failure, and goal is application continue running even if the components fail. Okay, for example, single VM, it start from user and go to the virtual machine. If the virtual machine fail, application down. But with the high availability design, with high availability design, it's look like it start from users, then it goes to load balancer, then it goes to your VM1, VM2, and so on. Okay, so if one VM fails, user continue using the other VM. Okay, so what is a disaster recovery? So if you see the definition, so disaster recovery or BCP, surviving the catastrophic failures. So in DR, focus on the recovering the IT infrastructure after a major disaster. Example, your region loss. And BCP is a broader business strategy ensuring the organization's operations continue during a cross-region applications with orchestrated manual scripted failover and RTO and RPO driven architecture. Okay, if I simplify the disaster recovery definition, so disaster recovery focus on the recovering after the major failures. For example, regional outage, flood, earthquake, fire, and cyber attack. So unlike the high availability, DR assumes primarily environment unavailable. Okay, so now what are the high availability versus disaster recovery? So what are the HR, sorry, HA versus DR? So in high availability, it handles the local failure, but in disaster recovery, it's handle the major disaster. Okay, in high availability, seconds or minute of the disruptions, but in the disaster recovery after a regional failure. Okay, in high availability, same reason, but in disaster recovery, usually it's secondary region. Okay, prevents downtime inside the high availability, but it restored business after disaster in the disaster recovery. Now, let's simplify what is backup. So backup means, so what is backup? So backup means creating the recoverable copies of data. Okay,
Uh-huh.
purpose,
Yes.
recover from the accidental deletions, corruptions, malware, human
Yeah.
error. Okay, ransomware. Okay, so backup means creating recoverable copies of data. Okay. Now, backup is not a disaster recovery. A very common
Okay.
AZ-305 questions like backup protects the
Hmm.
data, disaster recovery protect the entire workload, and architect usually need both. Okay, as per architect, if you are architect or going to be architect, so you usually needs both the data and the entire workload. Okay, so what is the fault tolerance? So fault tolerance means continue the operating despite the failure. For example, server failure or application is still running. Okay, let me write here. What is the fault tolerance? So fault tolerance means continue operating despite failures. Okay, like it start from server failure, then it goes to application still running. Okay, so
Hmm.
fault tolerance reduce the your downtime. And what are the resiliency? So resiliency means ability to recover the quickly. Okay, resiliency means resiliency means ability to recover
Hmm.
quickly. Okay, so now from what to recover quickly? So from failure. So cloud native architects are designed for the resiliency. Okay, so business continuity architectures look like. Let me write here. Business architectures look like. Enterprise design typically include the. It starts from high availability HA, then it goes to backup. Okay, then it goes to DR, then it goes to monitoring. Okay, then it goes to incident response. Okay, and what are the failure types? So tech should prepare for the hardware failure like disk failure, server failure, software failure like application crash, configurations error, network failure like router failure, internet failure, regional failure like power loss, flood, earthquake, human error like accidental deletions or misconfiguration. So recovery, what? So now, what are the recovery point objective? That is RPO, one of the most important AG-305 topics. So what is RPO? Okay, so let us stand the RPO. Okay, so if you see here, RPO is nothing. It is the maximum acceptable, okay, amount of data loss, and it answer how much time can pass between our last backup and the disaster. Okay, if I simplify, so RPO define maximum acceptable data loss measured in the time. For example, if the minute business accept losing the maximum 50 minutes of the data. Okay, for example, backup every 50 minutes, disaster occur, maximum possible data loss 50 minutes in that case. Okay, and there is lower RPO means more frequent replications, more frequent backups, and higher cost. And what is the recovery time objective, which is RTO, which is equally important. Okay, so now RTO, so recovery time objective, it is a maximum acceptable downtime, and it answer how fast do we need to bring the system back online. If I simplify it, so RTO defines maximum acceptable downtime. For example, RTO is equal to 30 minutes. Business impact the application recovery within the 30 minutes. Okay, let me write it for both. Okay, backup everything for 15 minutes, okay, and disaster occurs, then maximum possible data loss is equal to only 15 minutes, okay. And for
Yeah.
this is for RPO. And what for RTO? So in RTO, for example, RTO is equal to 30 minutes, then business impact, business expect application or server, etc. recovery within what minute? 30 minutes. Okay. So example, if failures happen at 12 p.m., then recovery will under 30 minutes, which is like 12 p.m. 25 p.m., which is acceptable. Okay. So in that case, RTO met. So lower RTO means faster recovery, more automations, more redundancy, and higher investments. Okay. Now RPO
Okay.
versus RTO. So very common exam question. So if data is lost, it's come under the RPO. If
That's you. Yeah.
yeah, if and in RTO there is downtime. In RPO there is minutes of data, but in RTO minutes of outage. In RPO there is backup and replications, but in RTO recovery process. So real world example will look like if a bank platform which has a requirement of the maximum data loss 5 minutes, okay, maximum downtime will be 15 minutes, then architecture must should support the RPO is equal to 5 minutes and RTO is equal to 15 minutes. Okay. So what are the business impact analysis? So in that case, architect often participate in business impact analysis, and there will be some of the question include like which applications are mission critical, what are the acceptable downtime, and what is the acceptable data loss, and which systems recover first. Okay. So now, like, what is the Azure business continuity strategy? So it will be look like typically in organizations. Okay, so it is start from, let me write here, Azure business continuity architectures look like they start from ability zone, then it goes to backup, then it goes to site recovery,
Okay.
okay, then it goes to geo replication, very important. Okay, then it goes to monitoring. Okay,
Okay.
so by this way, Azure Business Continuity Strategy works. Okay, which provide the multiple layer of the protections, like what is the shared responsibility. So Azure protects the physical data center infrastructures, platform availability, and customer are responsible for the backup policy, DR planning, recovery testing, and application resiliency. Okay, so now what are the common mistakes? Okay, so some of the common mistakes we usually do, like confusing backup with the what? Can you tell me? Confusing backup with the DR, disaster recovery.
Downtime.
No documented RPO, no documented RTO, never
Yeah.
testing, never testing recovery, single region architecture, and ignoring the business requirement. Okay,
Mm.
now, so what are the best practices? So best practices is define the RPO, define RPO and RTO. Okay, design for the failure, test recovery regularity, automate the failure wherever possible, implement the layer protections, implement the monitoring continuously, align the technology with the business priority. Okay, now let's take
Mm.
very common scenario. Okay, which is AZ-305 exam perspective. So let's take scenario one. Okay, if the maximum acceptable data loss is 10 minutes, so RPO is equal to 10 minutes. Okay, and
Mm.
if the applications must recover within 30 minutes, then RTO is equal to 30 minutes. And if
Mm.
there is a need for protection against the accidental deletion, then their answer will be always backup. And if the scenarios look like if needed for recovery after the regional outage, then your answer will be disaster recovery or DR. Okay, and like some of the interview questions look like, what is business continuity, what is a high availability, what is a disaster recovery, what is the difference between the backup and DR, what is RPO, what is RTO, how would you design a high availability Azure applications. Okay, and how would you define the recovery objective for a banking platform. Okay,
Mm.
so these are the interview questions which we were asked. Okay, so now actually business continuity is not just an IT objective. Okay, it is a business objective. Every technical design decision must align with the organization tolerance for the downtime and data loss. So for high availability, minimize the downtime, disaster recovery restore the operation after the catastrophic failure, and backup protects your data. So together they create a comprehensive resilience strategy. Okay, so two of the most important concepts every Azure architect must understand are RPO and RTO, and they directly
OPO. Mm.
influence the architect decisions, technology choice, and the project budgets. Okay, so now let's move to our next sections. Like we will explore the Azure backup and recovery service build, and where we see how the Azure help the organizations which protect the workloads and recover the data efficiency. Okay, so our next topic will be designing Azure backup, recovery services, vault. Okay,
Okay.
backup policies. Okay, and enterprise
Mm.
backup architecture. Okay, now, so in our previous topic, we learned the business continuity, high availability HA, disaster recovery DRA, fault tolerance resiliency, recover point objective, that is RPO, recovery time objective, that is RTO. So one of the most important interview questions is, if a user accidentally deleted the virtual machine or a database, how do you recover it? Okay, so the answer is not a high availability. Answer is not a disaster recovery. Answer is Azure Backup. So Azure Backup is the Microsoft Enterprise Backup solution designed to protect Azure and hybrid workload. Okay, let me write here. What Azure Backup. So Azure Backup is Microsoft Enterprise Backup solution designed to protect Azure and hybrid workloads. Okay, so imagine you are a Azure architect for a global financial situation. So there is a critical workload include the virtual machine, Azure SQL, SAP systems, file servers, Azure files, and on-prem servers. Okay, one day administrator accidentally delete the files. So and another day ransomware encrypt the data, and another day applications corrupt the databases. So there is a question arise: how do we recover? So there is architecture solution will be Azure Backup. So what is Azure Backup? If I simplify it, so Azure Backup is a Microsoft cloud-based backup service. It provides the backup, restore, long-term retentions, recovery for Azure and hybrid environment. So why do we need the Azure Backup? So high availability protect against the infrastructure failure, disaster recovery protect the against the digital failure, but Azure Backup protect against the accidental deletions, corruptions, malware, ransoms, and human error. Okay, so what will be the Azure Backup architectures look like? So Azure Backup architectures look like it start from Azure resource. Okay, then it goes to Azure Backup, then it goes to Recovery Services Vault. Okay, so Recovery Service Vault store the backup metadata and recovery points. So now the next topic will be your what is Recovery Service Vault. Okay, so one of the most important three AZ-305 topic. So Recovery Vault is a management container for the Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery. Okay, so what is Recovery Service Vault? So Recovery Service Vault is a management container for Azure backups and Azure Site Recovery. Okay, think of it as backup control center. It manages the backup policy, recovery points, okay, backup jobs, and restore operation. So recovery service vault architectures look like it start from your VM backup, okay, then it goes to what, your Azure files
Also, okay.
backup, okay, then
Okay.
it goes to SQL backup, okay, then it goes to SAP backup if there is available. It's very simple. Okay, so now what can Azure backup protect? So Azure backup support the Azure virtual machine, Azure files, Azure SQL database running on the Azure virtual machines, SAP HANA running on the Azure VMs, Azure blobs via backups and blobs. Okay, and on-premises servers like using the Microsoft Azure Recovery Point Service Agent, that is MARS, and Azure Backup Servers, that is MABS, or System Center D DPM. Okay, now let's take the real world scenario. So imagine a healthcare organizations need to protect the 500 virtual machine, 200 file shares, and 5 and 50 SQL server. So architecture recommendations will be recovery service vault, backup policy, Azure backup. And what are the backup workflow? So it starts from virtual machine, then goes to backup policy, then it goes to recovery service vault, then it goes to recovery point. Okay. So backup policy, one of the most important architecture responsibility. Okay. So a Azure backup policy defined when the backup runs, how often and how long backup are retained. Okay. So what are the backup frequencies? So ITEC determine the frequency based on the business requirement, RPO, and workload criticality. Okay, workload dependency. For example, for every hour, daily or weekly. For more frequent backups, reduce the potential data loss and but increase the storage and operational costs. Okay, so what is the full versus incremental backup, which is very important for interview topic. Okay, so in full backup, copies all the data, like all entire virtual machines. Advantage: complete backup. Limitation: larger storage, longer durations. Okay, but in the incremental backup, copies only the changed data, like only change since the last backup. Okay, advantage: faster, lower storage consumption, and lower network usage. So Azure backup primarily use the incremental backup after the initial full backup for supported workload. Okay, and what are the soft delete for the backup? So critical security features which protect the backup data against the accidental backup deletion and malicious deletions. Even if someone delete the backup data, Azure retain it temporarily for the recovery. And what are the immutable
Okay.
vault? So immutable vault is important for ransom protections. Like once enabled, backup cannot be deleted, backup cannot be modified. But during the configured retention period, it is used by bank, healthcare, government services, okay, and financial services, and many more. And what are the multi-factor authenticator for the backup operations? So sensitive backup operations can be require additional authentications which help the protect against the inside threats, okay, credentials compromise, and ransom attack. And what are the backup security? So architecture should implement the RBAC in Microsoft Intra ID, soft delete, okay, immutable vault, private endpoint where applicable, and least privilege access. So now, what is the Azure backup versus snapshot, which is very common in AZ-305 topic. So in Azure backup, there is long-term protections, but in snapshot, short-term copy. In Azure backup, policy-based, but a snapshot is manual and automated. Azure backup has a stored in recovery service vault, but a snapshot has a stored with this resource. Support retention are under the Azure backup, and limitation retention comes under the snapshot. And disaster recovery supports comes under the Azure backup, and not a full backup strategy comes under the snapshot. Okay, and what are the Azure backup versus Azure site recovery, which is another common topic. So in Azure backup, it protect the data, but in Azure site recovery, protect running the workload. Okay, in Azure backups, backup and restores. In Azure site recovery, replications and failover. In Azure backup, recover files and data. In Azure site recovery, recovered entire applications. And long-term retention for the Azure backup and business continuity for the Azure site recovery. So always remember, backup restore data and site recovery restore the business operations. Let me write. Point to remember. Okay. So backup restore the data and site recovery restore the business operations. Okay. Now, what will the enterprise backup architecture look like? So it is start from the virtual machine. Let me write here. Backup look like it start from the VM, then it goes to Azure Backup, then it goes to Recovery Service Vault, then it goes to what? It goes to Backup Policy, then it goes to Recovery Points. Okay. Now, what are the common mistakes? Okay. So, common mistakes are like no backup policy. Okay. No retention is too short, never testing the restores, disabling the stop delete, no immutable vault for the critical workload, and treating the snapshot as a backup. And what are the best practices? So create the centralized backup policies, align the backup schedule with RPO, enable the stop delete, enable the mutual vault for the critical system, and test the restore regularly, monitor the backup health, and document every positive one. Okay. So now let's take some AZ-305 exam perspective. So if the scenario will ask a user accidentally delete the important file, then answer will be Azure Backup Restore. And if the scenario asks need centralized backup management for the Azure VMs, then answer will be Azure Site Service Vault. And if the organizations require 7 years of retention for the compliance, okay, so your answer will be is backup policy with the long term retention. And if the scenario look like to protect the backup from the ransom and the malicious deletion, so answer will be immutable vault plus soft delete. Okay. So what are the interview questions look like? So the interview questions are what is a Azure backup, what is a recovery service vault, what is a backup policy, and what is the difference between the full backup and the incremental backup, what is the recovery point, how does Azure backup protect against the ransom, Azure backup and a snapshot, and Azure backup versus Azure site recovery. So backup is one of the most important fundamental responsibility of Azure attack. Even the most highly available and disaster resilience systems cannot protect against the accidental deletions or data corruptions without a proper backup strategy. So recovery service Vault act as a centralized management plane for the Azure backup, enabling the organizations to define the consistent policy retention schedules and recovery operations across their workloads. So as an ITech, you have to we should design the backup strategy based on the business requirements such as RPO compliance and long-term retentions, not simply on the technical convenience. Okay. So now in our next sections we will explore Azure Site Recovery ASR, where we learn how Azure enables full application failover disaster recovery during the regional outage. Okay. So our next topic is designing Azure Site Recovery ASR, failover, failback, cross region replication, okay, and disaster recovery. Okay. So in our previous topic, we learned Azure Backup Recovery Site Vault, backup policy, recover point retention policy, and backup security. However, the Azure Backup restores the data. It does not automatically restart an entire business application during the disaster. Imagine entire Azure regions goes offline. Recovering backups may take hours. So business like a bank, airlines, hospitals, and e-commerce companies cannot afford that. Okay, so they require automatic replications, fast failover, or minimum downtime. So this is where the Azure Site Recovery comes. Okay, and which is very essential. So imagine you are a Azure architect or a cloud architect for a global airline, and production environment has a web server, application server, database server, and identity services. Suddenly, the primary region outage. So question arise: can passengers still book a flight? Can employee access systems, and how quickly can service resume? So Azure Site Recovery is designed for these situations. So what is the Azure Site Recovery or Azure Site Recovery ACR? So Azure Site Recovery is a service. It continuously replicate the workload to the secondary locations, and if the primary environment fails, Azure can start workload in the secondary locations. And why do we need ASR? So without ASR, it starts from regional failure, then goes to restore backup, then goes to rebuild infrastructure, then goes to restore applications. So recovery may take hours or a day, but with the ASR, it starts from primary regions, continued application, and secondary regions. So recovery is significantly faster. So I so Azure. So what is the Azure Site Recovery architectures look like? So it's look like it starts from production. Okay, production workload, then goes to where replication, then it goes to Azure Site Recovery. Okay, then it goes to secondary region. Okay, so can what can ASR protect? So Azure Site Recovery support the Azure Virtual Machine, VMware Virtual Machine, Hyper-V Virtual Machine, physical servers. So some enterprise workload running on the supported infrastructures. Okay, so let's take the real world enterprise scenario. So a multinational bank hosts a online banking, payment gateway, fraud detection, and customer portal, where the requirement is regional disaster protections, faster recovery, and low RPO. Okay, sorry, low RTO. So architecture's recommendation is Azure Site Recovery and continuous application. Unlike the backup, ASR continuously replicate the changes. Okay, and and it architectures look like it start from the productions VM, then replication, then replicate VM, which is the minimal data loss. And what are the replications frequency? So replications occur automatically. Like benefit of it is lower RPO, faster recovery, reduced data losses. Okay, and what are the recovery plans? So one of the most important ASR features. What is recovery plan? So recovery plans. So recovery plans define. It allows the architecture to determine the exact boot order of the multiple tier application during the failover. Okay, if I simplify, recovery plans define how the workload recover during the failover. Like example, database is goes to this application server, then web server recovers, order matters. For example recovery workflow: step 1, business start database; step 2, start app servers; and step 3, start web server. So application recover correctly. Okay, and what are the failover? So very important. Okay, so failover means switching the production to the replicated environment. For example, it starts from primary region, then goes to failure, then goes to secondary regions, which become active. And what are the planned failover? Used during the maintenance, data center migration, infrastructures upgrade, and its characteristic is control, minimum data loss, and planned outage. And what are the unplanned failover? So occurs after the disaster, power failure, flood, or cyber attack. Like business continue from the recovery side. And what are the test failover? So one of the best ASR features which allow organizations to test disaster recovery without affecting the production. So it architectures look like it start from the productions, then it goes to test failover, then isolate the environment. So why test failover? So organizations should regularly verify the recovery plans, replication health, application functionality, and RTO compliance without impacting the user. Okay. And what are the fallback? So what are the failbacks? So failback is after the primary environment is repaired, sorry, repaired, workload returned from the secondary region to the primary region. So business resume normal operations. Okay. And whatever the disaster recovery life cycle looks like. So let me write here. Disaster recovery life cycle looks like is start from replication. Okay. Then goes to disaster. Then it goes to failover. Then it goes to business runs. Then it goes to primary restore. Then it goes to failure. Okay. So these are DR life cycle. Okay. Now, mm, okay. So now what are the ASR versus Azure Backup? So in Azure Backup, it's protect data. Okay. As we all know that, and Azure Site in Azure Site Recovery, it's protect the running workload. Okay. And backup plus ASR together, enterprise having the best practices for like to start from Azure Backup, then it goes to protect data plus Azure Site Recovery, then it's protect the application. So both services complement each other. Okay. And what are the enterprise disaster recovery architectures look like? It start from user, then it goes to Azure front door, then primary region, then Azure Site Recovery, then secondary region. Okay. So now what are the common mistakes? Okay. So common mistakes are like assuming the backup, okay, assuming the backup replaced by ASR and never testing failover, no documentation, recovery plans, and replicating the unnecessary workload. Okay, and also ignoring the application startup order and no fallback planning. And what are the best practices? So use ASR for the critical applications. Use Azure Backup for long-term recovery. Test failover regularly. Create a recovery plan. Monitor the applications continuously. Protect the recovery service vault. Define a clear RPO and RTO objectives. Now let's take the AZ-305 exam perspective for this topic. If the scenario looks like a production application must recover the automatically after the regional outage, then your answer will be always Azure Site Recovery. And if scenario is need to test disaster recovery without affecting the production, then answer will be always test failover. And scenario 3, like recovery order of the database application and the web server must control, then answer will be recovery plan. And if the scenario 4 look like if any need for both long-term retention and rapid workload recovery, then answer will be your always Azure Backup plus Azure Site Recovery. Okay. So basically, Azure Site Recovery is designed to keep the business running during the major failures, while backup protect the data. Site recovery protect the ability to entire application by continuously replicating the workload to the secondary location. So as a attack, we should think beyond the infrastructure. We must consider the applications, dependency, startup order, recovery objectives, and business priority. So recovery plans allow us to automate these complex recovery process. And one of the most common enterprise pattern is using the Azure Backup and the data protections, okay, which allow us to automate these complex recovery what processes. So one of the most common enterprise pattern is using the Azure Backup for production data and Azure Site Recovery for the application continuity. Together, they provide the comprehensive business continuity solutions. Okay. Now, in our next sections, we will explore this ability set, ability zones, load balancer, Azure front door, and enterprise high availability architectures like that minimize the downtime before the disaster even occurs. Okay. So, in our previous topic, we learned the Azure Site Recovery, recovery plans, plan failover, unplanned failover, test failover, failback, and cross region disaster recovery. So ASR help us to recover after disaster. But Azure Attack also asks another question: how can we prevent the downtime before the disaster occurs? So instead of waiting for a failure or recovering later, we should design a system that continue operating even when the
Yeah.
infrastructure's component fail. So this is
Uh-huh.
where the high availability HA architectures comes in. So imagine you are designing the Azure infrastructure for a global banking platform. So it architectures look like web tier, application tier, database tier, identity tiers. Okay. So customers expect 24 into 7 availability, zero service interruptions, fast response time, automatic recovery. So one failed service should never bring down the application. So Azure provides several
Okay.
services to achieve this. So what is high availability?
Mhm.
Okay. So what is high availability? So high availability HA means designing the system that continue the operating despite failure. Let me write here.
Okay, yeah. Absolutely.
What is high ability? So high ability means designing systems that continues operating despite
Yeah.
failures. Okay, in which the objective is failure occurs, then it go to application continue running. And what are the common cause of the downtime? Virtual machine failure, disk failure, host failure, rack failure, power failure, network failure. So I take design around these failures. Okay. So what is the Azure high availability? Azure high availability architecture look like. So it look like it start from users. Okay. Then it goes to load balancer. Then it goes to ability zone. Then it goes to multiple VMs. Okay. So what is the ability sets? So one of the most oldest Azure HA features ability sets protect against the host failure, rack failure, plant maintenance within the data center. Okay, so ability set architecture look like it start from ability set having the virtual machine 1, virtual machine 2, virtual machine 3, virtual machine 4, and so on. So Azure distribute the virtual machine across the fault domain or the update domain. Okay, now what is the fault domain? So a fault domain represents a group of the hardware sharing the power network and racks. Okay, like rack A, rack B, rack C, where Azure places the VM on the different racks. Okay, so without ability set, a rack has VM 1, 2, 3. Rack failure cause the entire application down. But with the ability sets, rack A has a virtual machine 1, rack B has a virtual machine 2, or rack C has a virtual machine 3, and so on. So in that case, application continues. Okay. And what are the update
Yeah.
domains? So update domains perform the platform maintenance without update the domains. Like it restart all the VM application available. With update domains, it restart the virtual machine 1, then virtual machine 2, then restart virtual machine 3. So application stay online. So what are the benefit of the ability sets? So protection from the hardware failure, plan maintenance support, increase availability, and simple deployment. And what are the limitations? So ability sets protect the inside one data center. They do not protect against the data center failure or regional outage. Okay, so for that, Azure provide the ability zones. So what are the ability zones? So one of the most important AZ-305 topics. So ability zones are physical separate data center within the same Azure region. Let me write here. What is ability zones? Okay, so ability zones are it is a physical separate data centers within the same Azure region. Okay,
Hmm.
and each zone has independent power, independent cooling, and independent networking. So, what are the ability zone architectures look like? So, it starts from Azure region, then it has zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. Okay, very simple. So, what is ability set versus ability zone? It's very important and common in AG305 questions. So, in ability sets, single data center, ability zone, multiple data center, fault domains comes under the ability sets, and physical zones comes under the ability zones. Update domains comes under the ability sets, and zone isolations come under the ability zones. Lower protections come under the ability sets, and higher protection come under the ability zones.
Hmm.
Okay, so now let's some AG 305 exam tips. So if the requirement to protect against the rack failure, then answer will be ability set. If the requirement is to protect against the data center failure within a region, then answer will be ability zones. Okay. Now, what is zone redundant service? So many Azure service support the zone redundant storage, zone redundant load balancer, and zone redundant database. So these automatically distribute the workload across the zones. Now, what are the Azure load balancers? So high availability requires traffic distribution. So what is Azure load balancer? So Azure load balancer, let me write here. Azure load balancer means it distribute network traffic, okay, across the healthy resources. Okay, and its architectures look like it starts from users, then it goes to Azure load balancer, then it goes to combination of VM1, VM2, VM3, so on. Okay, why we use load balancers? So without it, user goes to VM1, VM failure, application unavailable. With load balancer, traffic automatically goes to the healthy VMs. Okay, and what are the health probes? So Azure load balancer continuously check the VM health. If the VM fails, traffic redirected automatically. Okay, and there are the two type of load balancer: the public load balancer, which is internet facing application, and internal load balancer, which is private applications. Okay, so let me write here types of load balancer. Okay,
Hmm.
so this uh, public load balancer, another is internal load balancer. Okay, so internal load balancer, it is for private application, and for public load balancer it is for internet
Hmm.
facing applications.
Awesome.
Okay,
Yeah.
now yes, so what are the common mistakes? So The common mistake are single VM deployment, no load balancer, ignoring the ability zones, no health props, single religions productions. Okay, no failover testing. And what are the best practices? Use the ability zones for productions. Use ability set for the legacy workload where the zone available aren't available. Place the multiple VMs behind the Azure load balancer. Use the Azure front door for global web applications. Implement the help prop test failover regularly and remove the single point of failure. Okay. Now let's take some AZ-305 scenario. So if the scenario looks like applications must survive the rack failure. So answer will be ability set. Application must survive an entire data center failure within regions. So answer will be ability zones. If the scenario look like traffic must automatically distribute the across VM, then answer will be Azure load balancer. And if the scenario looks like if the user worldwide use the worldwide should connect the nearest healthy Azure region, then answer will be Azure front door. And if the scenario will be a global, it's both regional failover and web and acceleration. So your answer will be Azure front door and Azure front door plus ability zone plus Azure load balancer. Okay. Now, so yeah, today we completed one of the most important critical AZ-305 domain. Okay, which has designing business continuity, backup, disaster recovery, and health. Sorry, high availability solutions. So as a Azure Solution Architect, we are not just responsible for deploying the applications, we are responsible for ensuring the business continue operating even the failure occurs.
Yeah.
So failures
Yes.
are inevitable. Okay. So I take responsibility is to ensure they do not become the business disaster. So today topic
Mm.
directly influence the business continuity, serviceability, data protection, disaster recovery, and compliance and customer trust. Okay. Mm, so yeah. So that's bring us to the end of this sessions. Like today we learned how the Azure architecture design for business continuity, high availability, disaster recovery, Azure backup, recovery service vault, Azure site recovery, ability sets, ability zones, Azure load balancer, and Azure front door. So what are the key lessons? So great cloud architecture are not just judged by how they perform when everything works. They are judged how gracefully they continue operating when these things fail. Okay, so before our next session review RPO versus RTO, Azure backup versus Azure site recovery, recovery service vault, recovery plans, ability set and ability zones, and load Azure load balancer and Azure front end. Okay, so these concepts are
Yeah.
among most frequent tested in the both AZ-305 certification and your Azure Solution Architect interview. Okay, so yeah, thanks for
Absolutely.
learning with me today.
Thank you.
We will see you next. Okay,
Yes. Thank you so much.
okay,
Bye.
thank you. Bye bye.